The Pacific Islands during the Second World War created a battleground unlike anything the United States or Japan had expected when they began the conflict. Dense jungle, swamps that swallowed boots, steep volcanic ridges, and unrelenting humidity combined to transform even short patrols into ordeals. Fights that European tacticians imagined at hundreds of yards collapsed into sudden, violent clashes at a few dozen feet. In this claustrophobic environment, the U.S. Marine Corps and Army units carried into combat not only the standard M1 Garand rifles, Browning automatic rifles, and Thompson submachine guns, but also a weapon rarely associated with military campaigns, the 12-gauge pump-action shotgun. Its presence on the battlefield was a curiosity for the Japanese, who had little doctrinal anticipation of it, and even for many Americans it represented a throwback to hunting rather than a frontline tool of modern war. Yet thousands of them were produced and issued, creating a complicated legacy that has since been wrapped in myth and selective memory. The logic for sending shotguns to the Pacific seemed obvious at first glance. At extremely short ranges, few weapons could match their sheer stopping power. A single shell of 00 or 000 buckshot contained multiple large pellets, each capable of striking with the energy of a small pistol round. Fired from a Winchester Model 1897 or Model 1912, those pellets spread into a devastating cluster that required little precise aiming in the dark or in tangled brush. The Model 1897 in particular had a notorious mechanical quirk. It lacked a trigger disconnector, which meant the operator could hold the trigger down and simply pump the action to unleash a rapid sequence of blasts. Marines called this slam firing, and in the terrifying intimacy of a nighttime perimeter fight, it could feel like a personal artillery barrage. For a point man on a jungle trail, the weapon promised the ability to cut down an ambush before the rest of the patrol could even react. For a sentry, it gave confidence that a single pull and cycle could throw a curtain of lead across a gap in the wire. Japanese doctrine had little to say about such a weapon. Their manuals prepared soldiers for rifles, machine guns, mortars, and even the relatively rare submachine gun, but they had never conceived of the shotgun as a battlefield instrument. To them it was a civilian hunting arm, unsuited to professional war. Consequently, when Japanese soldiers first encountered Marines carrying short-barreled trench guns with bayonets fixed, it was less a shock than an oddity. Post-war interrogations and captured documents reveal virtually no references to shotguns as a distinct tactical threat. Unlike American artillery, tanks, or flamethrowers, which forced the Japanese to evolve countermeasures, the shotgun slipped past their strategic attention. That silence has fascinated later historians. It suggests either that the Japanese never considered them significant, or that they simply did not face them in numbers sufficient to matter. Reality on the ground complicated the weapon's promise. The Pacific climate proved merciless to early ammunition. Standard 12-gauge shells at the time were made with paper hulls. In the dry air of the continental United States, these performed adequately. But in the steaming jungles of Guadalcanal or New Guinea, paper absorbed moisture and swelled. A cartridge that had slipped easily into a chamber at the armory could become stuck and unusable after a few days in the field. Veterans remembered trying to pound swollen shells into their guns with the heel of a hand or a rock, a useless gesture in the middle of a firefight. The problem was so persistent that many frontline units began to relegate shotguns to guard duty rather than offensive patrols. Only in March 1945 did the U.S. formally adopt all brass-cased shells that resisted moisture, by which time the largest campaigns were already drawing toward their bloody conclusions. Even when ammunition functioned, logistics limited the shotgun's reach. A single 12-gauge shell was bulky and heavy compared to a 30-06 rifle round. A bandolier that could carry dozens of rifle cartridges might hold only a fraction of that number in shotgun shells. In amphibious operations where every cubic inch of space on a landing craft was contested, commanders prioritized rifles, machine guns, mortars, and grenades. That meant shotgun ammunition was often issued in small quantities, just enough for special roles, but not enough to sustain continuous combat usage. For all the American industrial capacity that produced thousands of trench guns, they could not be fed in numbers large enough to change the balance of a campaign. Nevertheless, Marines did find roles where the shotgun's characteristics were well suited. One common assignment was as the weapon of the patrol point man. Moving through jungle where ambushes could erupt at 10 yards, The wide pattern of buckshot gave the lead man a fighting chance to break the first burst of enemy fire and allow his comrades to maneuver. Another was night perimeter defense. When visibility collapsed to shadows and movement, a shotgun blast could cover an arc of approach without demanding precise marksmanship. Units guarding prisoners or performing military police functions also valued shotguns for their psychological effect. The menacing look and thunderous sound were effective at controlling crowds or deterring escape. On ships and in rear areas, the same qualities made them practical for close-quarter security. The Guadalcanal campaign in 1942 provides a snapshot of this mixed record. Marines brought shotguns ashore, and some patrols used them effectively in ambushes and close fights. Sentries described the confidence they felt with a pump gun in the dark, knowing one shot could sweep a gap. But official reports from the campaign largely emphasized the decisive role of rifles, automatic weapons, artillery, and air support. Shotguns appear mostly in anecdotes rather than statistics. Many were soon reassigned to airfield defense or military police details. By the end of the campaign, commanders recognized that while useful in specific niches, the shotgun was not a battle-winning instrument on the scale of other weapon systems. This tension between myth and reality grew stronger as the war continued. In later battles like New Guinea, Peleliu, and the Philippines, conditions often made the shotgun more liability than asset. Constant rain swelled paper shells. Mountainous terrain demanded lighter loads than bulky 12-gauge belts. Veterans often preferred the Thompson submachine gun or the M1 carbine for close work, weapons that shared some of the shotgun's advantages but were easier to supply and more reliable in the wet. And yet stories persisted of shotguns clearing bunkers or halting charges, individual moments where their brutal efficiency was undeniable. These incidents, magnified in memoirs and popular culture, would later feed into an enduring image of the trench gun as a symbol of American ferocity in the jungle. Part of that image came from the visceral experience of the weapon itself. Firing a slam-fired 1897 at night, muzzle blasting flame and the action clanging, created an impression unlike any other small arm. For the Marine holding it, and for comrades nearby, it felt like raw dominance of the immediate space. For any enemy caught within range, the effect was catastrophic. Even if such encounters were not statistically common, their intensity burned them into memory. In the retelling of war, the memorable often outweighs the typical, and so the shotgun's reputation grew larger than its documented role. As historians sift through wartime records, a clearer picture emerges. Shotguns were indeed present across the Pacific, but their deployment was fragmented, their ammunition problematic, and their overall impact constrained. They were valued by those who carried them, feared in the moments of their use, but rarely decisive in the outcome of campaigns. The Japanese, whether through oversight or indifference, never devised specific counters because the volume of encounters never demanded it. The Americans, despite industrial output, could not overcome environmental and logistical hurdles quickly enough to make them central weapons. Thus, the story of the shotgun in the Pacific begins not with triumph or failure, but with complexity, a specialized tool that found moments of brilliance, yet remained a footnote beside the greater engines of war. The Pacific War was not only a clash of fleets, aircraft, and sprawling armies, but also a war of terrain, vegetation, and intimate brutality. In this arena, the myths and realities of the shotgun as a battlefield weapon were shaped not merely by numbers, but by encounters that unfolded in thick jungles, on volcanic rock, and inside rain-soaked foxholes. The Japanese soldier, whose training had been anchored in bayonet drills and the cult of the charge, suddenly found himself facing an opponent who was often invisible until the moment of lethal contact. The American Marine or soldier crouched silently in the underbrush, finger curled around the trigger of a short, stubby weapon that carried the ghost of the hunt yet had been reborn for the battlefield. This was not the long, sleek Garand with its 8-round clip, nor the cumbersome Springfield of the Great War. It was something more intimate, something that turned the battlefield into a duel measured in feet rather than yards. For the Japanese soldier, who was drilled to see the American as hesitant in close quarters, the shock of meeting a man wielding a shotgun was shattering. The Japanese military ethos revolved around the offensive spirit, the belief that moral force and willingness to die could overwhelm mechanical advantages. Bayonet charges were not simply tactics, but rituals of cultural affirmation. Against Chinese armies or in the early Pacific conquests, such charges often broke weak or poorly prepared foes. But against Americans and Australians dug in with shotguns at their side, the equations shifted. The first blast of buckshot tore through the night, scattering lead into a pattern that ripped through ranks, leaving bodies shredded in ways rifles rarely produced. Survivors of such encounters testified that men fell as though hit by invisible fists, and those who staggered onward often did so dazed and bloodied, only to meet a second blast. The close-range devastation undercut the very foundation of the Japanese charge, the belief that sheer courage could close the gap. In place of hand-to-hand combat came sudden obliteration, yet it would be misleading to imagine that shotguns dominated every battlefield or that they turned every encounter into an American triumph. Their presence was selective, their distribution limited, and their logistical role secondary compared to rifles, machine guns, and mortars. What mattered was not their numbers but their symbolic weight. The shotgun became a weapon of psychological imbalance. American troops who carried them often felt a peculiar confidence, a sense that within 30 feet they could not be touched. The spread of buckshot allowed a single Marine to guard a jungle path or the mouth of a cave, with the assurance that even if his aim was imperfect, the weapon itself would compensate. This perception made him stand taller, steadier, more willing to wait rather than to panic under sudden assault. Conversely, Japanese soldiers came to view the weapon with dread, not because it appeared in overwhelming quantities, but because its effect was grotesquely memorable. In a war where propaganda and rumor often outweighed direct experience, the myth of the shotgun as an unbeatable close combat tool spread faster than the reality of its limited use. Combat reports from Guadalcanal through Peleliu mention the shock of the first shotgun engagements. A Marine firing from the shadows of a coconut grove could halt a small Japanese patrol with 2 or 3 blasts, leaving the survivors screaming or retreating into the trees. In the claustrophobic interiors of pillboxes and bunkers, the shotgun was nearly unrivaled. Rifles were too long to swing effectively in confined quarters. Submachine guns risked jams or wasted ammunition in bursts. The shotgun, simple and rugged, delivered a devastating punch at the exact distance where the Japanese soldier expected to rely on bayonet or grenade. Its wooden stock and short barrel allowed swift maneuvering, and its pump action or semi-automatic design provided follow-up shots at a rhythm as relentless as a war drum. But these scenes were interspersed with the broader reality of the Pacific campaign, weeks of rain-soaked misery, marches through swamps, and endless reliance on rifles, mortars, and artillery to reduce entrenched defenses. In such contexts, the shotgun was often sidelined, left in tents or leaned against the wall of command posts until specific operations demanded them. Even so, their presence lingered in the cultural imagination of both sides. American letters. Home spoke with a certain pride about the scattergun and its fearsome role. Japanese reports, though reluctant to praise enemy weapons, admitted the terror of its effect at close quarters, sometimes describing it as a weapon that transformed a single soldier into a squad's worth of firepower. It is also vital to consider the contrast between the weapon's heritage and its wartime use. For many Americans, the shotgun was tied to rural life, hunting birds or deer, defending farms against predators. Bringing it into the Pacific jungle was like dragging the frontier into modern war. Soldiers from the South or Midwest, accustomed to the heft and recoil of such guns, felt a strange comfort in carrying them across oceans. They were not just fighting with the government's rifle, but with something closer to home, something that resonated with their fathers and grandfathers. This familiarity heightened confidence and reduced the alienation of war. For Japanese troops who viewed war as an extension of spiritual and national duty, to be cut down by a humble hunting weapon rather than a mighty cannon or a machine gun felt humiliating. It was as if the natural order of battle had been violated, as though the American had cheated by bringing a weapon of the hunt into the sanctity of the charge. The evolution of this psychological contest was uneven across the islands. On Guadalcanal, where night raids and infiltration defined the struggle, the shotgun had its most legendary moments. Marines defending perimeters against screaming charges often credited their survival to the wide, merciless spread of buckshot. On Tarawa, where the battle was compressed into a few acres of sand and fortifications, the shotgun proved invaluable for clearing bunkers. At Iwo Jima, amid black volcanic ash and labyrinthine tunnels, it became a tool for sudden encounters in darkness, where the barrel might be pressed into an opening and fired blindly to annihilate whoever lurked within. Each of these moments added to the aura of the weapon, an aura that magnified beyond its actual role. The Japanese response to these encounters was not to abandon the charge or the doctrine of morale over material, but to harden further into fatalism. If buckshot shredded the body, then the soul must remain unbroken. Reports emerged of soldiers charging into shotgun fire with an almost suicidal disregard, not because they believed they could overcome it, but because they refused to let fear dictate their final moments. In doing so, they reinforced the American perception of them as both formidable and doomed. The shotgun thus became more than a weapon. It was a mirror reflecting the wider clash of cultures, one side anchored in martial spirit, the other in pragmatic lethality. In the broader context of the Pacific War, the shotgun's mythological presence loomed larger than its statistical record. Fewer shotguns were issued than rifles or carbines, and they never shaped strategy on the scale of artillery or aircraft carriers. Yet, in the memory of those who fought, they left marks as deep as the craters on Tarawa or the ridges of Okinawa. Veterans remembered them not as curiosities but as decisive companions in the moments when survival hinged on feet and seconds. The power of the weapon lay in its ability to shatter illusions, illusions of invulnerability, illusions of traditional combat, illusions of heroic charges overcoming firepower. Each blast was a brutal reminder that courage could not erase physics, and that in the tangled jungles of the Pacific, the scattergun could decide who lived to see dawn. The deeper the Pacific War progressed, the more both sides adapted their tactics to the grim realities of the terrain and the weapons that defined close combat. The Japanese soldier trained from youth to believe in the decisive power of spirit and steel, encountered not only the American shotgun, but a broader doctrine of firepower that magnified the terror of each close-range blast. On islands where every tree, ridge, or cave could conceal death, the shotgun became part of an ecosystem of weapons that worked in unison. The rifle held the line, the machine gun raked advancing troops, the mortar rained down on unseen positions, but the shotgun delivered the intimate final stroke. Its role was rarely solitary. Rather, it was the weapon that sealed encounters, that closed the door on desperate charges or sudden ambushes. The Japanese soldier who expected to meet a rifle thrust at bayonet range often found himself instead torn apart before his blade could find flesh. At the same time, American use of the shotgun highlighted a cultural pragmatism that contrasted sharply with Japanese idealism. For the Americans, war was not a matter of ritual, but of survival and efficiency. If a short, brutal weapon ensured survival in the jungle, then it was embraced without hesitation. This mentality produced tactics that maximized the shotgun's utility. Patrols moving through heavy undergrowth often placed a shotgun-wielding soldier at the point, a living tripwire against ambush. In night fighting, when silhouettes flickered, only briefly in the glow of flares or the flash of grenades, the shotgun provided certainty. A single pull of the trigger could sweep an area where hesitation might otherwise prove fatal. These practices reinforced the shotgun's association with sudden dominance, with wresting control of a chaotic space through overwhelming force at the shortest distances. For Japanese troops, this growing reputation created a kind of phantom on the battlefield. They often could not know how many shotguns were present in an American unit, but the memory of even a single encounter colored their expectations. Rumors circulated that the Americans used shotguns extensively, far beyond their actual numbers. Survivors of close-range clashes spread stories that magnified the weapon's horrors, recounting comrades cut down as though by invisible blades, wounds so terrible they defied description. In this way, the shotgun achieved a reputation larger than reality, a weapon of legend that haunted Japanese soldiers before they even faced it. This fear was compounded by the cultural dissonance, a weapon of the hunt, associated with animals, now employed against human beings in war. To fall before it seemed not only a defeat, but a degradation, a stripping away of honor at the very moment of death. Yet even as its legend spread, the shotgun's limitations persisted. Ammunition was heavy, magazines limited, and its effectiveness dropped sharply beyond 30 to 40 yards. Against an enemy positioned across a clearing or concealed behind fortifications at greater distance, rifles and machine guns remained indispensable. The shotgun was a scalpel in a surgeon's hand, not a hammer to smash all obstacles. American commanders recognized this and issued them sparingly, often assigning them to units expected to face particular close-quarter challenges. In this way, the weapon's reputation was paradoxically enhanced by its scarcity. Because it appeared only in certain situations, often the most desperate or violent, it came to be associated with pivotal moments. The mind does not remember the rifle shots that held a perimeter for hours, but it remembers the thunderous blast that stopped a screaming charge in its tracks. The environments of the Pacific amplified these effects. On Guadalcanal, the endless rain and dense foliage created firefights where visibility rarely extended beyond a few yards. The shotgun thrived in such conditions, its pellets tearing through leaves and branches to reach men who thought themselves concealed. On New Georgia and Bougainville, patrols through swamps often stumbled into ambushes at ranges so close that rifles were awkward. On Peleliu, where the coral ridges forced men into narrow defiles, the weapon was ideal for sudden confrontations. By the time of Okinawa, the Americans had refined their understanding. Shotgun-armed soldiers were indispensable in clearing the spiderweb of caves and tunnels that made the island a fortress. Each blast fired into a dark opening was both a practical tactic and a psychological statement. Nothing inside could survive. The Japanese response to these challenges was not innovation in kind, but intensification of existing methods. Bayonet training grew more ferocious, and night attacks more frequent. If the shotgun negated the charge in daylight, then perhaps darkness would allow a breakthrough. But here too the weapon proved itself. In night raids, the sudden, blinding muzzle flash of a shotgun followed by the horrific spread of buckshot shattered formations. Soldiers expecting to fall upon sleeping Americans instead found themselves stumbling into a wall of fire. The more they attempted to adapt by relying on surprise, the more the shotgun demonstrated its worth as the antidote to shock. It became the sentinel of American positions, a guardian that turned Japanese bravery into slaughter. Still, the war was not simply a duel between weapon and doctrine. Larger forces dictated the outcome. Naval superiority, industrial capacity, and air power all tilted the scales irreversibly in America's favor. Yet in the personal memories of those who fought, the shotgun carried weight disproportionate to strategy. Veterans later described it with a mixture of awe and grim satisfaction, recalling moments when its presence meant the difference between life and death. For Japanese survivors, those who lived to write or speak of the war, it became a symbol of American ruthlessness, a weapon that seemed to deny the very possibility of heroic sacrifice. It was not that it killed more efficiently in numbers, but that it killed with finality at the precise moment when honor demanded a chance for the blade. The cultural clash revealed by the shotgun extended beyond the battlefield. In American propaganda, the weapon was rarely highlighted. The rifle and machine gun represented the soldier's image. The shotgun was too brutal, too tied to hunting, too lacking in the elegance of military arms. But in the whispered lore of units, it became a talisman, the weapon one wanted beside him in the worst moments. For the Japanese, who prized the image of the bayonet and the charge, to acknowledge the shotgun was to admit the collapse of cherished ideals. Thus it lingered on the edge of official narratives, neither celebrated nor ignored, but present like a shadow over the recollections of those who faced it. By mid-1944, as the tide of war turned irrevocably against Japan, the shotgun's reputation had crystallized. It was not the weapon that won the Pacific, but it was the weapon that stripped the charge of its sanctity, that exposed the futility of courage unaccompanied by equal firepower. Each island that fell reinforced the lesson. Bravery alone could not overcome steel and lead. And in the narrowest, bloodiest corners of battle, nothing delivered that lesson more savagely than the thunder of a shotgun. For the Americans, it was a reminder that practicality trumped ritual, that war was about results, not appearances. For the Japanese, it was an omen that the war they fought was slipping beyond the realm of spirit and into the domain of unanswerable force. The war would rage on, growing bloodier with each island seized, but the shotgun had already carved its legend. It was a weapon whose myth, magnified by fear and rumor, traveled faster than its pellets, a myth that both sides carried into the final battles of the Pacific. In the jungles, on the beaches, and in the tunnels, it became a symbol not of technological advancement, but of raw, elemental violence, the kind of violence that leaves no room for illusions. And in that, it marked a turning point in the confrontation between two worlds, one that believed in the supremacy of spirit, and one that believed in the supremacy of firepower. By the time American forces pressed deeper into the Central Pacific, the shotgun had already gained its aura as a tool of finality and close-range fighting. Each new campaign reinforced its reputation. On the beaches of Tarawa, as Marines clawed their way through seawalls and into Japanese positions, the shotgun showed both its strengths and its limitations. The chaotic landings under machine gun fire and heavy artillery demanded rifles, grenades, and flamethrowers more than scatterguns. Yet once the beachhead was secured and the battle devolved into clearing bunkers and sandbagged positions, the shotgun again found its voice. In narrow spaces where a soldier had only a heartbeat to react, the weapon delivered immediate dominance. One pull of the trigger sent multiple projectiles scything into the dark, a deadly burst that required no perfect aim. In such moments, the difference between survival and death was often measured not in precision but in volume of destruction. This pattern repeated itself across the island chain. On Saipan, patrols moving through sugarcane fields carried shotguns at the front and rear of their columns, weapons ready to answer ambushes that could erupt without warning. In the suffocating heat, when soldiers were half-dazed from exhaustion, the psychological assurance of having a shotgun in hand kept men steady. The sound of its blast was not only lethal to the enemy but comforting to comrades, a thunderclap that told them they were not alone in the green gloom. Even men armed with rifles admitted that when a charge came, they looked to the Marine with the shotgun to break it first. The psychological presence of the weapon often outweighed its actual use. Its scarcity lent it mystique. Few carried it, but all trusted it. On Guam, the same stories surfaced. Shotguns were issued to units expected to clear villages and jungle huts where Japanese defenders hid. In these close-quarters battles, the scattergun was ideal, stripping away concealment and annihilating opponents before they could throw grenades or thrust bayonets. Its very brutality became part of the American tactical approach. When facing an enemy who embraced death, one had to reply with weapons that left no room for counterattack. In the hands of confident Marines, the shotgun symbolized that response. It was direct, overwhelming, and final. Where the Japanese sought transcendence in sacrifice, the Americans sought survival through firepower, and the shotgun was their rawest expression of that creed. Yet alongside these battlefield accounts ran a quieter story. The strain of carrying such a weapon in conditions it was not always suited for. The shotgun's limited range meant that in open ground or prolonged firefights, its carrier could feel underpowered. Ammunition was heavier and bulkier, reducing the number of rounds a soldier could carry compared to rifle cartridges. Mud and rain sometimes clogged barrels or swelled wooden stocks, though most soldiers testified that the shotgun, rugged and simple, withstood abuse better than many expected. Still, it was not a universal solution. Its role was narrow, defined, and occasional. But when its moment came, no other weapon could equal it. This duality, occasional use but overwhelming effect, ensured its legend grew larger than life. As battles moved closer to the Japanese homeland, the stakes grew higher, and so too did the savagery of fighting. On Peleliu, the coral ridges forced combat into narrow gullies and caves. Shotguns became indispensable tools for these encounters. Marines would fire blindly into openings, knowing that within the darkness Japanese soldiers waited with grenades or satchel charges. The blast of buckshot not only killed but suppressed, discouraging any attempt at sudden rushes. In many cases, soldiers fired into caves not to kill immediately, but to stun and disorient, then follow with grenades or flamethrowers. The shotgun was thus woven into the brutal symphony of close-quarters warfare that defined Peleliu, a sequence of fire, blast, and flame that reduced each strong point at terrible human cost. For the Japanese, whose doctrine exalted last stands and suicidal defense, the shotgun added another layer of inevitability. Even if one avoided grenades and flamethrowers, the scattergun waited at the threshold, making escape impossible. By the time of Iwo Jima, the weapon's role was firmly established. The island's volcanic tunnels and pillboxes demanded relentless clearing operations. Every foot of ground was contested, every crevice a potential ambush. Here, the shotgun's short length and devastating spread were invaluable. Soldiers crawling through ash and rock often held them at the ready, fingers tense on the trigger as they advanced into shadows. The weapon became as much a torch as a gun, its blast illuminating dark spaces for an instant while cutting down anything inside. Veterans later recalled the eerie contrast: the silent approach through tunnels, then the thunderous roar, followed by sudden silence. In such moments, the shotgun seemed less a weapon than a ritual instrument, part of the grim liturgy of tunnel warfare. But it was on Okinawa, the bloodiest of the island campaigns, that the shotgun's legend reached its peak. The Japanese defense there combined fortified ridges, concealed caves, and night infiltration. Every tactic that might bring soldiers into close contact was employed, and every American unit learned the value of the scattergun. Marines and soldiers alike came to see it as their shield against sudden death. In village fighting, the weapon cleared houses with terrifying ease. In night raids, its blasts shattered Japanese formations before they could breach American lines. In caves, it worked hand in hand with flamethrowers, grenades, and demolitions. The Japanese soldier, who once had faith in the decisive power of the bayonet, now faced a wall of fire where courage alone availed nothing. The shotgun's roar was the punctuation mark on countless small battles within the larger storm. Each blast a reminder that the charge, once noble, had become futile. These encounters left scars not only on bodies but on memories. Veterans remembered the weapon in visceral terms: the recoil, the smell of burned powder, the sound of pellets tearing through foliage and flesh. For some, it was a source of grim pride. For others, it was a haunting memory, a symbol of how war reduced human beings to targets at arm's length. Japanese survivors, too, carried their memories, often describing the shotgun as one of the most terrifying weapons they faced, not because it killed more efficiently, but because it stripped away the chance to fight back. In their accounts, to die by rifle or artillery was expected, but to be obliterated by a weapon of the hunt felt almost degrading. This cultural dissonance magnified the fear surrounding it. As the Americans prepared for the anticipated invasion of Japan itself, plans included extensive use of shotguns for urban and cave fighting. Thousands were stockpiled, ready to be issued. Though the atomic bombs and Japan's surrender ultimately prevented such an invasion, the very expectation underscores the shotgun's place in the American arsenal. It was no longer seen as an auxiliary tool, but as a necessary companion for the grim work of clearing fortified spaces and facing fanatical resistance. Had the invasion occurred, the shotgun's role might have grown even larger, cementing its place not only as a weapon of myth, but of strategy. By the war's end, the shotgun's reputation had outstripped its statistics. It had not won battles by itself, nor had it been present in every engagement. But in the moments where men fought face to face, where courage and fear collided at a few feet of distance, it was often the weapon that decided survival. Its legend endured because those moments etched themselves into the memories of survivors. In letters, memoirs, and post-war stories, the shotgun appeared again and again, described not as a common tool, but as a decisive one. For Americans, it was proof of pragmatism and ingenuity. For Japanese, it was a reminder of futility and humiliation. And for history, it was a symbol of the brutal intimacy of the Pacific War, a war where myth and reality collided as violently as the men who fought it. As the Pacific War drew toward its conclusion, the reputation of the shotgun was firmly embedded in the psychology of both sides. For the Americans, it was a weapon of reassurance, the faithful companion for the most dangerous moments. For the Japanese, it remained a source of dread, an ugly reminder that bravery and sacrifice could be shredded before they even reached their target. Yet beyond the battlefield, the shotgun carried a symbolic weight that revealed deeper truths about the nature of the conflict. The Pacific was not merely a contest of armies. It was a collision between two worldviews, one rooted in tradition and martial spirit, the other in adaptability and pragmatic firepower. The shotgun, humble and unglamorous, represented that pragmatism more vividly than perhaps any other weapon. On Okinawa, where the fighting reached its most brutal crescendo, the shotgun's presence was felt everywhere the terrain forced combat into confined spaces. The Shuri Line, a labyrinth of ridges and caves, demanded close-quarters battles day after day. Marines advancing through villages armed with scatterguns found themselves clearing homes one by one, each door and each window a potential death trap. Japanese defenders, armed with grenades or bamboo spears, were cut down before they could close the distance. Veterans remembered these moments not as battles fought across yards of ground, but as sudden eruptions of violence measured in feet. In these fleeting confrontations, the shotgun was unrivaled. It ended fights before they began, leaving behind a silence that was often more haunting than the combat itself. The psychological effect of the weapon grew stronger as the Japanese resorted to night infiltration tactics. On dark, rainy nights, squads of soldiers crept toward American lines, attempting to penetrate perimeters and sow chaos. These attacks relied on shock, on the idea that sudden violence could unravel American discipline. But the shotgun disrupted this calculus. A sentry armed with one could unleash devastation with a single blast, shredding the tightly packed attackers and halting momentum instantly. The sound of the weapon's roar cut through the night and often marked the turning point of an attempted raid. The Japanese, who expected to rely on fear, found themselves facing a weapon that amplified it instead. Their desperation only increased, but each attempt met the same brutal response. For the Americans, the shotgun also became a bridge between past and present. Many soldiers, especially those from rural backgrounds, had carried similar weapons in their youth while hunting. To wield one in war was both familiar and surreal. Letters home often reflected this strange connection. The same gun that once brought down birds in autumn fields now brought down men in the jungles of Asia. This continuity gave some a sense of comfort, as though a piece of home had followed them into the nightmare. Others found it disturbing, a reminder that the boundary between the hunt and the battlefield was thinner than they had imagined. Either way, the shotgun carried a personal weight unmatched by most other weapons. It was not just military hardware, but a cultural artifact pressed into the service of total war. The Japanese saw it differently. In their eyes, the shotgun was not merely another American firearm, but a distortion of warfare itself. Rifles and bayonets were considered honorable, extensions of the warrior's spirit. Even machine guns, though devastating, were seen as part of the modern battlefield. But the shotgun, designed for hunting animals, represented something base and degrading. To be killed by such a weapon was to be equated with prey rather than with an enemy worthy of respect. This perception added to the fear it generated. It stripped away the illusion that death in battle was noble, replacing it with the grim reality that death was simply death, brought by whatever tool proved most effective. In this way, the shotgun attacked not only the body but the cultural soul of the Japanese soldier. The weapon also played a role in shaping American military identity. In post-war narratives, the rifle and machine gun dominated the imagery of victory, but among veterans, the shotgun often held a special place. It symbolized the Marine Corps' emphasis on adaptability and the Army's willingness to experiment with unconventional tools. The shotgun was never a mass-issue weapon, yet its reputation grew because it was remembered at the most vivid, terrifying moments of combat. Veterans who carried one often spoke of it with pride, recounting how it saved lives in the tightest situations. Others, even if they had not used it themselves, remembered the confidence it inspired in units. In war, where fear was constant, that confidence was as valuable as bullets. As the war neared its end, plans for the invasion of Japan highlighted how integral the shotgun had become. American strategists anticipated house-to-house fighting in cities, as well as tunnel warfare in mountains and caves. Thousands of shotguns were stockpiled in preparation. They were to be issued widely, ensuring that every squad entering confined spaces had one or more at hand. Though the atomic bombs and Japan's surrender made this invasion unnecessary, the preparation itself testified to the weapon's perceived value. It had grown from a supplemental tool into a core component of close combat doctrine. The very fact that it was planned for such a massive operation underscores how much faith American planners placed in its utility. In reflecting on its role, one must remember that the shotgun was not a weapon of grand strategy or sweeping battles. Aircraft carriers and bombers decided the war's trajectory. Rifles and artillery claimed far more lives. But the shotgun held a different significance. It was the weapon of moments, the sudden ambush, the midnight raid, the claustrophobic tunnel. It was the weapon that spoke in thunder when silence and fear hung over soldiers. It was the weapon that reminded both sides that war was not only about numbers and movements on a map, but about men staring into the eyes of their enemies at distances so close they could smell each other's sweat. In that terrible intimacy, the shotgun ruled. By the time the guns fell silent in 1945, its reputation was sealed. To the Americans who carried it, the shotgun was a faithful ally, a tool that had delivered survival in impossible circumstances. To the Japanese who faced it, it was a source of horror and humiliation, a weapon that denied them the chance to fulfill their warrior ideals. And to history, it became a symbol of how myth and reality intertwine in war. The shotgun did not decide the Pacific Campaign in terms of strategy, but it decided countless small encounters, and those encounters shaped the memories of those who fought. Its myth endures because it touched the deepest fears and the most desperate hopes, because it was present in the moments when human beings were closest to the edge. When the war in the Pacific finally ended, the shotgun carried with it a legacy that was both larger and smaller than its actual role. Larger because the stories told about it magnified its power far beyond the statistics of the battlefield. Smaller because in the grand sweep of the conflict, it was only one tool among many. Yet weapons are remembered not simply for the number of casualties they cause, but for the impressions they leave upon those who face them. The shotgun became unforgettable because it was not a distant weapon of strategy, but an intimate weapon of survival, tied to moments of terror and triumph experienced at arm's length. It spoke directly to the human experience of battle in a way that few other arms did. For the Americans, the weapon became wrapped in a sense of practicality and ingenuity. The war in the Pacific was unlike anything they had faced before. Dense jungles, volcanic rocks, torrential rains, and a relentless enemy forced constant adaptation. The shotgun fit neatly into this environment. It required no complex training, no fragile maintenance, and it performed tasks that no other weapon could do as effectively. It was at once a tool for combat, for defense against infiltration, and even for occasional hunting of game when supply lines faltered. Veterans remembered it as the weapon they trusted when the fight became personal, when the jungle seemed to close in, and when the line between life and death narrowed to seconds. For the Japanese, the memory was darker. In diaries and post-war reflections, their descriptions of the shotgun often carried a tone of bitterness. To them, it was a symbol of the American refusal to fight in the proper way. The martial code that had been drilled into them celebrated bravery in charging forward with bayonets or holding a position until the last breath. To be cut down suddenly by a blast that could not be dodged or parried was more than a tactical defeat. It was a wound to their sense of honor. The shotgun left scars that were not only physical but cultural. It became one of many reminders that their traditions, however noble, had met an opponent who valued survival and efficiency over ceremony. As time passed, the myth of the shotgun in the Pacific grew in retelling. Soldiers came home and shared stories, often magnifying the terror it inspired. Accounts circulated of entire enemy squads felled by a single blast, or of Japanese soldiers abandoning charges the moment they heard its roar. Whether these stories were entirely true mattered less than the way they captured the essence of the experience. In every war, myths emerged to explain the unexplainable, to give shape to the fears and triumphs that statistics cannot. The shotgun became one of those myths. To those who carried it, it was the weapon that never failed in the clutch. To those who faced it, it was the weapon that turned courage into futility. After the war, the American military reflected on the role of the shotgun. It was not adopted as a standard issue across the armed forces, yet it remained in the arsenal, its usefulness undeniable in certain situations. Korea and Vietnam would see its return, once again proving that in environments where enemies were close and terrain was unforgiving, the shotgun had no rival. But its reputation from the Pacific never faded. That theater had forged its legend, and every later conflict carried echoes of those island battles where the shotgun spoke loudest. The weapon's symbolic role also extended beyond the military. In American culture, the shotgun was already familiar as a tool of the farmer and the hunter. Its presence in war blurred the lines between civilian life and combat. Soldiers who had once used it in fields and forests back home now associated it with caves and jungles half a world away. This overlap reinforced the image of the citizen soldier, the ordinary man who brought a piece of his everyday life into the most extraordinary of circumstances. In stories and films after the war, the shotgun often appeared not as a symbol of advanced military power, but as a reminder of simplicity and reliability. It embodied the idea that in the chaos of modern war, sometimes the oldest and most basic tools were still the best. Yet, as much as it was remembered fondly by those who wielded it, the shotgun also represented the brutal intimacy of war. A rifle or machine gun might kill at a distance, but the shotgun killed close, often within yards. Its victims were not faceless shadows on a horizon, but men whose features could be seen, whose shouts could be heard, whose last movements were witnessed directly. This intimacy etched memories into the minds of those who used it. Many veterans carried those images for the rest of their lives, struggling with the nearness of the deaths they had caused. In this way, the shotgun became not only a weapon of war, but a reminder of the moral weight that comes with fighting so close to the enemy. In Japan, the memory of the weapon remained tied to the bitterness of defeat. Post-war accounts sometimes exaggerated its cruelty, portraying it as an unfair tool used by an already overwhelming enemy. Such narratives served both to explain their own losses and to highlight the cultural gap between the two sides. To the Japanese, the shotgun was not just another firearm. It was a symbol of the uncompromising nature of modern war, where old codes of conduct crumbled under the weight of efficiency. To face such a weapon was to face the collapse of an entire worldview, and in that sense, the shotgun left a psychological scar long after the war ended. Ultimately, the story of the shotgun in the Pacific is not about statistics or strategies. It is about the human dimension of combat, about how a simple weapon could influence emotions, perceptions, and memories on both sides. It is about the way myths are born in war, myths that carry forward into history and shape the way future generations understand the past. The shotgun did not win the Pacific War by itself. Aircraft carriers, submarines, bombers, and endless supplies of rifles and artillery did that. But the shotgun's legacy persists because it captured something fundamental about the nature of that conflict. Its closeness, its desperation, its reliance on the simplest means of survival. When historians look back, they may count the shotgun as a minor player in the grand story of the Second World War. But for those who were there, it was anything but minor. For the Marine in a dark tunnel, it was the difference between life and death. For the Japanese soldier charging across a clearing, it was the sudden thunder that ended hope in an instant. For the cultures that collided on those islands, it was a symbol of their different approaches to war, one clinging to honor, the other to survival. And for the generations that followed, it became part of the legend of the Pacific, a reminder that sometimes the most ordinary tools can leave the deepest marks on history.